Welcome to everybody. Despite of a challenging time, the Center for Study of Europe continues with a series of online events, including public lectures, interview series, panel discussions, and workshops as the one we are hearing today. So I'm thankful for initiative from the center to keep things going on despite of COVID-19 pandemic. I think this demonstrates that how strong we are and that at the end of the day, we will continue with our job and our work regardless of circumstance. The question for today is Russian media influence in the US and Europe. So is it just a myth or Russia is as powerful as Western media presented? As you know well, today's media influence operations don't need state support to be successful. Russia can stage many cost-effective and impactful operations with the help of local actors. But the question is whether there is a grand strategy behind it, or it is just an instinctive short-term reaction to an opportunity opened by the Western indolence. So today we will host two researchers who will present their works on Russian media influence in the US and Europe, as well as the analysis of whether international news media are creating a common information space for Russian-speaking groups in the EU, particularly in Estonia. And Estonia definitely is a very particular place for Russia because of a significant Russian-speaking minority. First to present her work is Elizaveta Kuznetsova, a visiting researcher at our center. She's also a research fellow at the Center for International Policy Analysis at City University of London. Before completing her PhD in international relations, she worked as a broadcast journalist in Russia and the UK, definitely expert on what she's going to present. She specializes on public diplomacy, Russian foreign policy, and former Russia Today, today's RT. Her work, therefore, will be focused on a role of RT. The title of the work is Kontrpropaganda Today, the Roots of RT's Defensive Reporting. So, Elizaveta, floor is yours. And once you finish, I will introduce the second presenter.
Okay, thank you very much, Veshko, for the introduction. I will briefly give a context on this project. This is part of a larger project that I started during my PhD, and I am now, well, since then it has developed quite substantially, as it always happens. You start with a certain question that then guides you into a certain direction, and then it often requires a researcher to rethink approaches. So I started this project by looking at RT's reporting, at RT's framing of stories. And what I noticed during that research was that a big proportion of its content is structured around direct responses and countering Western broadcasters, in particular the BBC, the CNN, Sky News, and others. But in academic literature, this phenomenon is not discussed. Conceptually, some of the authors who look at the content that RT disseminates, they emphasize such tools of influence like conspiracy theories, for example. Yablokov has looked at that in detail, and he proposes the concept of conspiracy theories as the way of defending against the other, so constructing an enemy and delegitimizing the discourses of the West, which I found that on RT as well, but I think that it does not answer all the questions that we have about RT, in particular, how and why RT spreads Russian propaganda, in particular if we bear in mind that a big proportion of journalists on RT are actually international staff, so not only Russian journalists work for RT. Secondly, what actually informs its practice? Is there a direct strategy that is communicated from Kremlin that everybody follows? And most importantly, is there a grand strategy behind its operations? To answer those questions, I feel that it's important to shift our focus a little bit. So what I've noticed that the current academic research is primarily focused on what I show in this slide as the top level and the medium level of political communication. So they look at that there is a Russian government that wants certain outcomes in terms of its foreign policy, and therefore they design a strategy of communications that is then implemented by the Russian public diplomacy sector that includes a variety of, well, by now includes a variety of different outlets, in particular Sputnik, RT, RIA Novosti news agency. But I feel that this does not allow us to see the more detailed practical aspect of this, which in my opinion, and that I will show later in this presentation, actually affects very substantially what kind of reporting RT produces. So I feel that it is important to look at journalistic practices in detail to understand how RT functions every day, what editorial procedures it follows, what are the ethical norms that the journalists who work for the network adopt, and consequently what format of reporting it produces. So guided by these considerations, I proposed an argument that RT's methods of persuasion emerged out of the Soviet Kontrpropaganda tradition, which is a Russian for counterpropaganda. It can be understood as an institutional practice that lies at the roots of defensive format of reporting that I will explain in detail in a bit. And then I go a little bit on a higher level of abstraction from there, and I explain that I see it as a reactionary discourse that journalists of the network use in their strive for legitimizing not only Russia as a country, but also RT as their employer. So a few words on counterpropaganda as a concept. On the one hand, it seems quite straightforward what we mean by counterpropaganda. On the other hand, conceptually, it is not a very well developed concept. So traditionally, it's understood as a set of messages intended at refuting critical claims, reversing its effects on public, and delegitimizing the opponent. This is the sort of overarching definition that I derived from the literature that was preoccupied with the Cold War research on Soviet propaganda. In contemporary academic discourse, this concept is almost never used. It is used a lot in other areas. In military discourse, it's used a lot, counterterrorism, and so on. But when it comes to discussing Russian public diplomacy, it is very rarely used. One of the authors who discusses it in relation to public diplomacy is Kahl, and he proposes two sort of classifications of what counterpropaganda is. He states that it's a tactical, it has a tactical function to counter specific messages of the enemy, or simply the discourse of the opponents. On the other hand, it has a strategic aspect in which it forms an entire communication policy that is aimed at delegitimizing the enemy. And what I feel needs to be integrated into this conceptualization is the systemic effect of counterpropaganda, the systemic feature of it. And why I think this is very important, because in particular in the Soviet Union and in the way that propaganda worked in the Soviet Union, this is an important understanding of propaganda that needs to be discussed. Because in the Soviet Union, counterpropaganda formed an education. So it was integrated into education of kids and in education of school students, into the education of university students, and even the education, how they call it, which I do not agree with fully, in the workplace, which formed a lingering ideological effect that until today in post-Soviet Russia manifests itself in discourse. So to showcase how that worked and how I see it is related to RT in particular, I've done research in the archives in Moscow, Ergani archive, where I looked at the records of the Department of Propaganda of the Communist Party. I also looked at CIA's biweekly propaganda guidance, where they discuss Soviet propaganda during the Cold War. And I've performed interviews with current and former employees of Russia Сегодня network, and some of the former Inoveshchania, which is the Russian name for broadcasting abroad in the Soviet Union, to see whether there is a certain legacy between that is still present in today's public diplomacy practice of Russia, which helped me understand the connection between counter-propaganda and RT. So just to the findings, I could talk about this a lot, maybe in the question part of this workshop. Here I will briefly mention how I classify the findings rather. I see that Soviet counter-propaganda had three main functions. And these functions, I did not make them up. They are very carefully codified in the educational literature of the Soviet propaganda department. And so the first function is tactical function, the second is legitimization function, and the third is patriotic function. I'll explain what I mean by that, and I also show exactly how this works on RT today. So first, the tactical function. It is quite straightforward. It is the simplest way we can understand counterpropaganda, that is aimed at refuting claims of the opponent, of sort of redirecting the blame back at the source where this blame originated. And in the case of RT, this can be seen almost in every news report when, as we see here on the photograph and the screenshot, that the RT reporter shows a video from CNN and claims that what is shown there is wrong, is a false claim, and that RT counters it directly. So it is a clear case of counter-propaganda. It's clearly identifying the source of the message and refuting this claim on the spot. So this is the tactical function. And the more, that was an old example, the more recent example, just in April this year, Alexei Navalny and his team of researchers have investigated Russia Today's RT's way of gaining views on YouTube, and they found out that they use pornography websites to fake those views, to multiply them. And they've released a very detailed report on how that works in practice with screenshots, some YouTube analytics, and RT, this is RT Russia, so for those who are interested, there is a link in this presentation, but the video is in Russian. So they released a defensive report in which they answer directly to every claim that is made in Navalny's report, which is presented in a very, very strong, almost offensive language by the presenter that you can see on the screen. And again, answering every little message that was blaming RT for, and of course they were denying all of these claims that they use pornography websites. So the next function is legitimization function. So RT, just as Soviet propaganda, really are struggling with the lack of credibility in the West. And in their attempts to remedy this shortcoming, RT intensifies its countering efforts through delegitimizing opponents. How that works in practice is that they use a grotesque and satirical style of reporting, which is in a way a classic way of delegitimizing and countering the claims of those who blame the network. And they try to discredit or even ridicule foreign journalists. That was one of the main tasks of Soviet counterpropaganda, and this is still one of the main tasks of RT today. They very often attack foreign journalists quite directly, and of course using untrue quotes, the fake news, sort of linguistic construct. So this is very, very similar to what was going on in the Soviet Union. What it means on the procedural level, here we can also see a lot of parallels between how it worked in the Innovatiania network and how it works on RT today. So just how the day of a Soviet Innovatiania worker looks like and how it starts, that the day starts by looking at, reading all the reports from the foreign newspapers, Soviet émigré newspapers. But while traditionally journalists would look at that just to inform themselves on the news that happened in the world, here the goal was to find where and how these foreign newspapers attacked Russia, or back then the Soviet Union, to find ways to counter each and every of these messages. And on RT, a similar practice happens. They monitor all the CNN, BBC, Sky News, and newspapers to find blames, to find where and how Russia was blamed, for what reason, and how to find ways to counter those. Another thing that happens on RT is that they find experts who can attend their programs, and the way they find them is that they look at who has somewhat critical of the West views, and these views can be both far right or far left. It doesn't matter as long as they are not establishment views. Again, a very similar tactic that was used during the Soviet times. And the last function that I identified as patriotic function. So while counterpropaganda should primarily be understood as a method of argumentation and not a set of normative statements. So I think that this is an important distinction. That is why it is important to look at the practices of journalists on the network rather than more ideological statements, because in the end, ideological statements matter much less than how the argument is structured. So it can be said that when it comes to patriotism, that in a way, patriotism remained in the contemporary Russian identity in general, also as a discursive practice. So it is in a way stripped from its ideological connection, but the structure of the argument remains. And in that respect, this was very, very explicit in the way in which RT framed the annexation of Crimea. And when I was interviewing the journalists who worked for RT at the time and were involved in reporting the referendum, most of them confessed that they were genuinely supporting what was going on and that they did not see how Russia was an aggressor. They saw that Russia was the liberator. So it is a completely different framing. And what was quite noticeable when I was also viewing videos and analyzing frames that were used during that referendum was that most of the stories and even the images that were shown on RT were exactly the same stories and videos that were shown on other international broadcasters like the BBC and the CNN, but the framing of the events was obviously entirely polar. In contemporary Russia, counterpropaganda is deeply embedded in the normative understandings of Russian journalistic practice that serves as a background for what most recent scholarship calls self-censorship. As this scholarship says that propaganda never works. So the censorship, which is of course related to propaganda. So what can you tell and what you have to tell to the audience. These concepts are very much connected. And self-censorship works in the way that there is no direct coercion. There is no direct way. You cannot trace where somebody tells you what to report as a journalist. It works in a more diffuse way, that there is a certain consensus, unspoken consensus of what is allowed to report and what is not allowed to report. So it's a more of this kind of productive power that the framework of Kontrpropaganda that was embedded into basically any piece of literature, any piece of political analysis in the Soviet Union, it has gradually been building up in the minds of people through repeated exposure, and even people who did not agree fully with these concepts, they nevertheless adopted this format of this frame of thinking, the framework and the structure of the argument when they analyze international affairs. And you can, even when you speak to Russian people who are not related to propaganda, who are not related to any form of public diplomacy, you can still trace these elements of frames that form a certain argument when they talk about international events. So even if journalists do not fully accept the framework, they functionally adopt the practices that would reproduce state discourse, so the desired by the Kremlin discourse. And they are no believers in the system, but the practices and this kind of procedural inertia has made for this continuation of Kontrpropaganda as a method. And as an example, so when Putin conceived the idea of RT, he says that it was by no means meant to be engaging in apologetics of Russian politics. What they wanted was the absolutely independent news channel, but not, so the dates are not so far from each other. The editor-in-chief of RT claims very differently from what Putin has envisioned, and she legitimizes RT for the sort of the taxpayer, the Russian population, that the country needs this network just as they need the Ministry of Defense. So this is quite a misunderstanding there, it seems. But again, I don't think it is. I feel that on the level of journalistic practice, this is just what Russian journalists are used to. They're used to understanding their profession as normatively being a defensive, countering, legitimizing the policies of Russia, and this is what they know. They know how to do it. They know very well all the methods of doing it in terms of the argument and the discourse, and this is what forms what I identify as defensive format of reporting. So just to conclude, RT's reporting is informed by Soviet Kontrpropaganda framework, which is more of a tactical way of refuting claims rather than having a very strategic and well-defined communicative strategy. And its discourse is rather reactionary and responsive rather than monologic, propagating specific norms and values. So that's all from me.
Thank you, Elizaveta. Thank you for your presentation. As I promised, I will come back to it and for the question later on after Heidi present her research. I'm glad to introduce another presenter, a researcher today, and to say hello to Heidi, who I know relatively well. But Heidi, we are meeting for the first time. She's a doctoral researcher at the Tartu University in Estonia. Very interesting place when it comes to Russia. It's the country which was the first in the world, happened under full-fledged cyber attack back in time, that almost 20 years ago. She's currently completing her PhD studies at the Institute of Media and Communication in the Faculty of Social Sciences at Tartu University. Her research focuses on the interaction roles of international news, external and internal perceptions, and individual narratives in the identity formation process. Her previous publications have compared how different international news outlets frame issues and actors, assessed coverage of international events in online media, and investigated the role of international exchange programs as tools in state-to-state relations. Her current project is focused on Russian minority in Estonia. It's titled International Media from Below, Assessing Relevance in Online News for Russian Speakers in Estonia. Heidi, floor is yours. Looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Veshko, and everybody for allowing me to speak as a kind of a guest to your community. So without further ado, I will share my presentation here. Okay, and as you can see in the title, my presentation is assessing whether there's a common information space in Russian. And this presentation is sponsored by the Estonian Research Council, and it's supported by my current PhD work at the University of Tartu. So first of all, since my case focuses a lot on Estonia, I want to give some background information. Estonia geographically, as you probably know, and as you can see here, is located next to Russia and Finland. So geographically, it's kind of on the edge of Russia and the European Union. But ideologically, the location of the country is much more complicated. Because of its history, it could be considered post-Soviet. Because of its geographical location, it could be considered Eastern European. Because of the way that this Estonian government promotes itself and tries to frame itself, it could be considered a Nordic country. And because it's a member of the European Union and NATO, it could be considered a European and Western country. So ideologically, the location is a bit complicated. And as you can see in this map, which is on the right side of your screen, what you see in red here is the location of Estonia's Russian-speaking population. So because of Estonia's history in the Soviet Union and the human distribution practices during the Soviet period, it left Estonians' population with today about roughly 25% ethnic Russian speakers and significantly more Russian-speaking, maybe not ethnically Russian, but Russian-speaking members of society who are assumed to be consuming Russian media, more or less. But if you see the map of Estonia, you notice that there are these pockets of Russian speakers. And even in such a small country, Estonia is maybe about half the size of South Carolina, but these Russian-speaking populations in Estonia are very different. And I don't have enough time to go into detail about all of these right now, but even in such a small country, for example, the distance between these two is maybe like 3 hours, but the populations are significantly different. So the reason for the study comes from actually English-speaking media. And I considered in the past in my research how actually English media covers this region of Estonia and Latvia with Russia as kind of a border region. And as you can see here in the English media coverage, the discourses that have been covered in the past have changed quite a bit over time in the last 7 or 10 years. So I start with first discourse, which is about the national securitization. So in the period of 2013 to 2015, English media covered this region mainly from the lens of, is Estonia and Latvia next? Are Estonia and Latvia next to be taken after the Russian situation in Crimea? So there was a lot of national securitization in Estonia, focusing on individual countries. Then in 2016, with the US elections, it became international securitization with speculation about Russian interference in the US elections and actually the capabilities of Russia to interfere in the elections. And then in international media covering Estonia in particular, in 2018 to 2020, there was a big shift from this securitization discourse to focus on local Russian culture. So it kind of moved away from securitizing Russian speakers and this Russia issue to focusing on the distinctions between local Russian speakers in Estonia and in these borderland regions, which aren't necessarily connected to broader Russia, as we often saw before. And the fourth one has a question mark because considering our current situation, there's probably been a significant change. And we see this, you can see the bottom article here as the most recent one that I could find in the English media, stay at home and prepare for occupation. And this is talking about how while people are staying at home, they're being influenced by more Russian media or media from Russia, and this particularly relates to Russian speakers in borderland regions. And the top headline you see was from 2019 from Deutsche Welle, and it describes Narva as the EU's Russian city, but with a positive connotation about Russian city, about it being the EU's Russian culture city. So it discusses the nuances that the city has. So in the English media, there has been a lot of research about actually how, despite the fact that a large amount of English media is influenced maybe by the US or UK media, that still English media that reaches different countries has distinctions. So that there's not one common English information space, but that states are still largely filtering this information. And foreign news is actually being filtered through domestic voices. So, but this is in English. So when we consider the Russian information space, the way it's been covered in the English news media, it basically considers that there's one common Russian information space, and it's because it has a big player that's supporting a lot of different Russian channels. And if we consider the case of Estonia, this research is a little bit old, but it shows that historically there has been a divided information space and a parallel information space in Estonia. So if you look on the left here, you see ethnic Estonians or Estonian speakers. The yellow shows that they're consuming mostly Estonian commercial channels. And if you look at non-Estonians, the majority of which are Russian speakers, it shows that they're consuming the 5 main Russian TV channels. And this means Russian TV channels from the Russian Federation. So this is the source of media that's available to people and that individuals in Estonia are consuming. So historically, this has changed a little bit because in 2014, Estonia also launched its own Russian language channel, and it's growing in popularity. But the discourse has still remained that there's a divided information space. And this became very prevalent in the news media, especially in 2007. So as you might know, Estonia had a very peaceful transition from the Soviet Union into the European Union and NATO. But in 2007, for the first time, Estonia experienced riots in the streets. And it was because of this statue, which is a World War II memorial. It was a Soviet memorial, and it's a symbol of Victory Day for Russian speakers. So this is the place on the 9th of May where Russian speakers in Estonia come to lay flowers and pay their respect for those who died in World War II. But the Estonian government decided they would move it from the city center, and it caused a significant uprising. And actually, it was very shocking for the government. They didn't expect that anyone would react this way. And Martin Ehala has a very nice article. It was published in 2009, so quite a long time ago. But it really explains how the reason it was so shocking for the Estonian public shows the divides in society, that they didn't recognize how important this symbol was. And on the bottom here, you see actually this picture is from 2018, but it was in an article from just recently, like a week and a half ago, about, again, May 9th. And the title of the article is Why Estonians and Russians Don't Understand Each Other on the 9th of May. Because for Russian speakers, the 9th of May represents the end of World War II. For Estonian speakers, the 9th of May represents Estonian occupation into the Soviet Union. So this flag, which is the black and orange stripes, represents very different things. For Estonians, it might represent occupation. For Russians, it represents liberation. And actually, with this article, I was really happy when I found it at first in Russian. This article, Why Estonians and Russians Don't Understand Each Other, on May 9th from a Russian outlet. But then when I did some more research, I found out that it was actually originally published in Estonian by an Estonian author with an Estonian name and an Estonian publication. And then 2 days later, translated the same article, basically just translated, but into a Russian source with a Russian name. So it was a very interesting how the information was represented here. And this third picture that we see, this was also from very recently. It was currently Estonia for the first time is a member of the United Nations Security Council. And actually because of the current corona, we can't meet in person. So Estonian technology was used to organize the meeting on the 9th of May, or it was the 7th and 8th, but about the 9th of May. And in this meeting, this article depicts how Estonians organized it, kind of represented Europe very well, represented the West, but how Russia in this meeting kind of represented a lot of criticism that the way that Europe and the West was trying to represent the 9th of May does a disservice to World War II. And it was a very long speech. And this article kind of shows the ideological divide. So I know it's a very long introduction, but based on all of this, my key questions, so the broader question that I'm trying to research with my whole PhD project is how united or fractured is the Russian information space across borders. And the main border that I'm focusing on is Russia and Estonia currently. And how do information frames in Russia compare across these borders? Considering that there are Russian outlets from the Russian Federation, and increasingly there are domestic local Russian outlets, especially in Estonia too, since it has launched its Russian TV channel. But what I'm going to focus on mainly here is how active media consuming Russian speakers in Estonia connect with the information that they receive. So what do I mean by connectivity? Basically, by connectivity, I mean how users use this information. So Elizaveta spoke a little bit about how journalists are active in the process, and that there's often a focus on this normative question, how people should use the media, how we should use different sources. And this normative question is also very present in Estonian society with Russian speakers. What type of media should Russian speakers consume? And the large consensus is that it should not be Russian state-sponsored media. So the 4 types of connectivity that I look at are inclusiveness, which is what people are connecting about and like who with, engagement, so what formats, what social media platforms are they using, relevance, how they use this information in their everyday life, and constructiveness, so what value this information gives to them. So basically what I did is I collected headlines from Yandex news algorithms, and I can discuss a little bit later in the discussion why I chose this, but there were several reasons. And I dissected the discourses that were present in these algorithms. So I collected from the Russian algorithm, the Estonian algorithm, and the Latvian algorithm to kind of compare. And what I'm going to focus on here is actually the results I got from a 2-stage interview process where I used some of these headlines. So with my interview, what I actually did is I collected the headlines and I stored them separately. But in my interviews, I wanted to generate some response participation. So actually, in the first stage of my interview, I asked my respondents to first propose an article that they would use for themselves in their daily lives. And they went through the process of how they find this information, where they find this information, what kind of information they're not interested in. And then the second stage, well, in the first interview, the second question I asked them is to find one news article that they might share with somebody and describe who they would share it with, what format they would use to share this information, and why they picked this. So in the second interview, actually, what I presented the respondents with were 58 headlines. So 28 of these headlines were from fellow respondents. 15 were from the Estonian Yandex news algorithms, and 15 were from the Russian news algorithms. And this was on paper. So they just went through and clicked like plus, minus, I'm interested, I'm not interested, and discussed a little bit why they were interested, why it wouldn't be interested based on the headline. The second thing I did is actually created with these headlines an online forum, similar to like a Facebook page, where users could click and see the picture, the headline, and if they wanted to read the whole article, and then kind of interact virtually with the other respondents without like knowing who they were. So it protected the privacy and personal information of my respondents. So what I found initially actually from the headline coding, and this was the discourse analysis of how these headlines framed Europe, actually was very similar with what Elizaveta commented on about these different tools that RT uses. Because when I coded the Russian headlines, and I should clarify that all of these were in Russian, and many of them were from Russian state-sponsored sources. So there were some like Estonian, some Latvian sources, but this doesn't account for the difference in discourses actually. So when I like coded the Russians, I saw a lot of these discourses that Elizaveta was speaking about in her presentation as well. But what I also noticed is that there's very little overlap in the discourses between Estonia and Russia. There's actually much more overlap in the discourses between Estonia and Latvia, or Latvia and Russia, than there is in the case of Estonia. So the way that is presented in the headlines here did not seem to show much overlap. And also the headlines were very diverse in Russia and Estonia. So there are many different sources. It wasn't like one outlet is dominating the news scene. But from respondents, what I found actually from this chart, you can kind of see what they responded. So respondent headlines are represented here in the reddish orange color. And what you notice is that significantly more respondents said that they were interested in the headlines of other respondents. And then that they were interested in Estonian headlines and very little interest or much less interest in the world headlines. So if you notice these numbers, from not interesting, you have 89. So this was respondent headlines, and it goes up for the interesting. But not interesting, world headlines 124, it goes down significantly. So the Russian speakers were really not interested in these headlines that were randomly selected. They didn't know where they came from, but they just didn't seem to be interested. In fact, they were uninterested, so they put minuses here. So what my main findings with this were, when I went back and dissected the interviews, is that in terms of inclusiveness, Russian speakers in Estonia tend to connect with local issues related to their place of work or study. So they're not connecting with these issues that seem far away, even if they're in the same common language. Engagement, many of the respondents, so there were 15 that I spoke with total, but 12 were included in this analysis. They're avoiding news. Actually, many find their news on Facebook and claim that all important news comes to them from there, or they rely on personal contacts. So they're kind of closing out many news channels. In terms of relevance, information that is most relevant for them is logically associated with their job or their place of work, and they're rarely sharing information on a public platform. So mostly just with personal communications as well. And with constructiveness, they connect with and value information that seems useful and not hyped up. So if headlines tell too much, or they tell too little, or they seem kind of sensationalized, it kind of turned the users away. So these are some individual responses, just to emphasize the point that information sharing is mostly done with friends and people I know, and not really getting information from news sources, but mainly from Facebook and personal contacts. So the main thing that I want to kind of end with is the discussion. I don't really have a conclusion because this is an ongoing process. But I want to answer Veshko's question that he asked in the beginning. Is it a myth? No, it's not a myth, but something is definitely happening. But what I really want to stress with my research is that there's a danger in really for minority groups, and especially linguistic minority groups. So yes, and that's the end of my presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you, Elizabeth. My question for Elizabeth is concerning what you were discussing at the end of your presentation. And it's what I can call like some type of self-censorship or some subtle structure pressure on journalists working in RT. But my question is actually twofold. The first is how important and how influential Soviet narrative today is in Russian society among the ordinary Russians. How much they rely on that type of narrative. And the question for you regarding this censorship is, I think that even here everywhere in the world, including the US, when journalists work in media, they think about how they contribute to the common good, actually how they contribute to the benefit of society, of the state, but they may see the benefit differently. While I guess here in the US, journalists will see benefit in supporting freedom of speech, different views, plurality of views, and so on and so forth. Then how journalists working in RT and in other like a state-owned, state-sponsored media in Russia see what benefit for state is and their role in it. That is my question for you, and the question for Heidi to think about before Elizaveta answers is you presented a slide in which is obvious that share of viewers between Estonian speaking media and the Russian speaking media and Russian sponsored media is different because Estonian people watch Estonian media, whereas Russia speaking minority watch either Russia local media or Russia sponsored media. Then what is the biggest challenge for Estonian speaking people or Estonian speaking media to reach out to a Russian minority? You mentioned some differences, how they see the past. But what about the present? What about Ukraine? What about other issues which are relevant? The role of the EU, role of NATO, and so on and so forth. So, Elizaveta, if you can answer my question first, and then Heidi second.
So about the importance of the Soviet narrative, the Soviet discourse in contemporary Russia, it's an interesting question because I feel that it is very present, but it is present in a different way than you would think. So it's not that it is connected to the, so in the Soviet Union, the ideology of communism and Marxism, as you know, was very, very strong. And this was a very well-defined type of framework that you could understand what is what and who is the enemy, that capitalists are the enemy, and that the whole country had a goal. They had a common goal towards which they could work. In contemporary Russia, there is no such thing. There is no common goal. There is, on the other hand, the idea of patriotism and the desire to be recognized in the international political sphere is very, very important. So that does enter, that does form part of norms, of normative understandings of Russian identity, that's for sure. That's why I call this more of a structural patriotism rather than value patriotism, because the understanding of what Russia is, what it means to be Russian, is not very well defined. What is well defined is that Russia is great and that Russia should be recognized, that Russia is allowed to have a say in international affairs. And that's why I call this countering discourse rather the discourse of those who strive to seek legitimacy. So they don't feel marginalized, they feel misrepresented and not recognized, and therefore they try to legitimize themselves in this information space. In terms of how RT's journalists see whether what they do benefits Russia or not, this is also not, this question I cannot answer definitively, because firstly, as I mentioned, that there are different journalists who work for the network. Some of them, they have completely different backgrounds. The Russian journalists are guided by both this understanding, so that they live in this information space of Russia. They were brought up in it, and I have this kind of post-structuralist understanding of how ideology works, that if you are born in that country, even if you don't believe in certain values, the kind of discursive structures you still adopt and you reproduce them. And so that's how I see Kontrpropaganda is reproduced. So Russian journalists definitely see that RT is beneficial for for the promotion of Russia as a country internationally. The journalists who do not have Russian background do not have this attitude, and they are guided by quite different normative understandings of what they are, what they do as journalists. And they think they are tired, they're generally tired. So when I talk to those journalists, they said they are tired of what the establishment media is, that there are just talking heads and that they do not do proper reporting, and that RT actually has journalists who go into the war zones and things like that. So they genuinely think that they are working for a news outlet that is good and beneficial for the public, well, not in Russia, but in the West. So I feel that there are quite different conceptions there.
Thank you, Elizaveta. Heidi?
Yes, so it's also a very interesting question. I should have emphasized in the beginning that my particular research focused on trans-local Russian speakers. So these are not representative of the entire population. They're these individuals who have moved from a different area to work or study in a different part of Estonia. But I can answer a little bit of your question about the media and what the challenges to Estonian media are. And actually, when it comes to Estonian media, if I look at the recent cases, I think they're doing a very good job of getting rid of the securitization discourse that kind of ostracizes Russian speakers or has the potential to do so. Recently, one of the head of the Estonian National Party in nationalist party in Estonia framed the coronavirus in terms of this linguistic issue or Russia issue, and brought up this old discourse of living in a separate information space, and kind of suggested that Russian speakers in Estonia are maybe less equipped to deal with the virus, that they're spreading it because they're not getting the correct information. But when I look back and look at all the Estonian media, there were lots of statistics that say actually this isn't true. Infections among Russian speakers are just the same as among Estonian speakers. So the discourse is still there, but the Estonian media is actually trying to calm it and not repeating it. But what I think could continue is there's this tendency to kind of securitize anyone who thinks that the EU or NATO or these players are a threat. To say that somebody who thinks that the EU is a threat or NATO is a threat to our society is on the wrong side ideologically. But actually, if we look back before Estonia joined the European Union in 2002 or a little before, actually the European Union was considered by some parts of the Estonian population to be a threat to Estonian national identity. This has since changed a little bit, and the discourse has now changed to trying to frame Estonians Russian speakers as European Russian speakers, which also is kind of problematic because I think that this research would benefit greatly from crossing the border to St. Petersburg to compare how Russians in St. Petersburg feel about being European or not European. I think this is one thing that the research on Russian-speaking minorities in Estonia and Latvia is lacking, and it's kind of stigmatized to compare the populations. Usually there's so much effort spent to say what's different about these populations, why are Estonian speakers different? But I think that the research maybe could benefit from focusing on where the similarities are and where these similarities end. So taking kind of the opposite approach, because culturally there are some similarities, linguistically there are some similarities, but not being afraid to actually say that there are some similarities and that's okay, and see what the differences, where these similarities end and the differences begin, actually would maybe be a more positive approach.
Thank you, Heidi. Now it's time for others to pose questions. Please introduce, actually you don't need to introduce yourself. I think that everybody sees your name on the screen. Igor and Alia, let's take 2 questions and then answers. Igor, you are the first.
Thank you. I have just comments on each of the papers. I promised not to have any, but for some reason I was so inspired by your papers that I do have some comments. And so first of all, thank you for this inspiration. I never thought I would be interested in a study of communication, but here it is. So my first comment on Elizaveta's contribution is as follows. I do appreciate the links that you have uncovered between the RT of today and the old Soviet practices. Certainly one must not be blind to that. In all these important events that's happened in the past 20 years, we see that the current Russian media, for all their sophistication, essentially have adopted the old Soviet practices. That means stonewalling and lying. So let's say the special services poison Litvinenko, and Moscow says, never happened. They poison Skripal and his daughter. The official response is, you're paranoid. It never happened. They make fun of it. They shoot down the MH17, 300 people scattered across a field in Ukraine, and Moscow says the CIA did it, or certainly we never did it. There is the bike assassin in Berlin. If you say that there are Russian connections, they say you're a paranoid liar. So the question to Elizabeth would be, why is nevertheless the current Russian propaganda so much better than the old Soviet propaganda? I grew up in an atmosphere of Soviet propaganda, and although I was just a dumb kid, by the time I was 10, I could tell that it was just a pack of lies. Why is it that you go to Warsaw, you go to Budapest, you go to Serbia, you go to Montenegro, you go to the Czech Republic, and you find intelligent people mouthing the lies of the RT? Why? I think, Elizaveta, you have omitted one important thing, and that is the Americanization of today's Russian propaganda. The reason why the RT, although in substance it's indistinguishable from the old lies, the reason why the RT is so much better is that it's become Hollywoodized, it's become Americanized. It's so slick, it's so brilliant, it's so easy to digest it, very much like junk food as opposed to good food. My two comments on Heidi's presentation. So first of all, thank you for the reference to the bronze soldier. And I would just suggest that it would be interesting to look at why the RT and certainly the Kremlin look for so similar projects in other places, like in the Czech Republic. At the moment, the most hot political debate involves the statue of Marshal Konev, who, of course, has a great statue in the center of Prague as the conqueror of Berlin. And people have been demanding for decades the removal of this ugly thing. And they say, yes, he was a conqueror of Berlin. And yes, we're willing not to discuss how he treated his own soldiers and how he treated German women and Czech women and civilians elsewhere. Let's, all right, close this and say that war is hell. But he was also the butcher of East Berlin in '53. He was the butcher of Budapest in '56, and he contributed to the military planning of the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia in '68. Let's get rid of it. So the city of Prague gets rid of it, and the Soviets, the Russians, turn it into an international incident. And the current debate is that in fact, the politicians responsible for the removal of the statue have now police protection because the secret services discovered that an assassin arrived in Prague with poison in his suitcase. And my second and final comment for Heidi pertains to the treatment of the Russian speakers and Russian minority, certainly in Estonia, but perhaps even more importantly in Latvia, and I wouldn't ignore even Lithuania. Let's think about the Sudeten Germans in the 1930s in Europe, both in Poland and certainly in Czechoslovakia, but the German minority elsewhere in the Balkans too. All those countries during the interwar period had denied them access to German sources of information. And the result was that by the time Hitler was clearly on his way up and successful, let's say 35, 36, 37, 80, 90, perhaps 95% of these people would be on Hitler's side. And some Czech intellectuals said at the end of the crisis in 1938, a sentence that I think should be easily part of your study, Heidi. He said, you didn't give these people access to sources of clean water. And now you're surprised to see they drink from dirty puddles of Hitlerism. And I think this is relevant today as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Igor. Alia next, and then answers.
Yeah, I have a comment, perhaps, and a question. So, Heidi, I really like your project. I think this is sort of super interesting in the methodology, sort of the way in which you get to collect different kinds of information on people, which kind of gives you an opportunity to see what people actually are responding to. I think that's super interesting. Sort of as a sociologist, I think this is just really interesting stuff. But something that you said actually informs my question for Elizaveta, and that is that the vast majority of Russian speakers, right, they receive information from other sources, so like Facebook, sometimes friends, things that friends post. And so my question is sort of coming from actually the opposite side than Igor's, because I don't know how successful RT really is, certainly RT abroad. So who actually watches it? I've never watched an RT news, and I'm not expecting to, I ever will. None of my friends ever watch RT. So I don't actually watch TV, period. And I don't know how unusual I am. I read news. I cannot stand people talk to me. I have no time for that. So, so do you have any idea on the coverage of RT sort of abroad? Because it seems like they're actually investing a lot of resources into creating a certain image for the international audience by hiring English-speaking journalists, which is another interesting question. You said that a lot of them are kind of tired of the establishment news and want to try something else. Surprising to me, I actually thought their main reason is that, well, it's a job like any other. So like, there's not that many jobs out there. So this is a job that probably pays well, and we'll just do that. But maybe I was wrong. So what is your sense of actually I'm not even sure I know where you can get RT in the US. Is it sort of by subscription? Are there pockets of Russian immigrants that sort of subscribe to this kind of thing? The older people? I have no idea. My parents do not live here, so I have no idea what
Try the internet.
On YouTube, on YouTube, you can watch anything.
I don't watch much YouTube, I guess, either.
But
so I'm sort of protecting my, inner kind of sanity in that respect. But I'm sure there's some data on like how influential actually is, who watches it, and that's it.
Yes, thank you very much for the questions. So in terms of the popularity of RT, it's not a very easy question to answer, because first of all, how do you measure popularity? Do you measure it by looking at how many views RT gets on YouTube? That is not very telling, because first of all, well, as I've portrayed or as Navalny has uncovered, although I don't know how accurate that investigation is, but you can easily just manufacture those views, and you can promote videos, but you do not really know how well the frames that they promote actually resonate with the audience. So it's very difficult to measure the success. On the other hand, what you can see is that the mainstream media is villainizing RT and giving it quite a bit of publicity in the West. So in my opinion, by doing that, they actually promote RT and also construct its success. So it's a tricky question. I cannot tell you for sure whether RT is successful. If to sort of respond to Igor's comment about Soviet propaganda being not successful at all. So it is true that Soviet propaganda was not so successful, but also Soviet propaganda, I do not say that Russian propaganda today is the same as Soviet propaganda. It is different, first of all, because there is no normative ideology behind it. They do not try to promote, they do not try to do the so-called positive propaganda, white propaganda. And in that respect, it is very different. So what I show in my paper, I didn't have time to present it in detail, that in the 80s, the transition period between the Soviet broadcasting abroad and contemporary Russian public diplomacy. So looking at this transition period, you can see how so my interviews with the former Innovatiania staff showed that Soviet propaganda was concerned about this lack of positive effect in the West, and they were trying to think, how can we improve that? And one of the ideas that was up in the air in the 80s was actually to establish a TV channel and to use more of a Western format of reporting. So that was one of the ideas, but then obviously the Soviet Union collapsed, and there was a break in broadcasting abroad. But it, in a way, those considerations were taken into account when they established RT. So in that way, I don't see it exactly as two separate things, but rather a continuation of something that didn't fully disappear, but just transformed into a different type of persuasion, if you like. About RTs, journalists who work on the network because it's a job that pays, yes, of course, and this is discussed a lot in media studies, that journalists they are guided by pragmatism in a way, because, well, they need to find jobs, and journalism is such a profession that it's very difficult to find jobs. But what in RT's case, what they mentioned, that since RT is such an infamous TV network, it actually, so if you go and work for RT as a journalist, it might be problematic to then progress in your career in other Western news outlets, because there is a stigma working for a Russian state broadcaster. So here, I don't know to what extent they fully realize that when they apply for jobs on RT. I cannot know that, but probably they do have a hunch that if they really want to be independent journalists, that they should think twice before going and working for RT. There's this consideration
Just
as well.
one quick follow-up question to what you said. So if the viewing data on YouTube is unreliable, how does the RT knows what their viewership is?
Well, they do take this. I mean, they need to justify their existence. So they, in front of the government. So of course they use this data as official data. They also employ foreign PR companies to help them promote the channel. For example, in the UK, in London, RT's banners are all over the tube, where it's really, really prominent. And it does so. What on the other hand, I noticed why, again, if you assume that RT is successful in certain echo chambers in the West, and this is what I'm trying to theorize here with the counter-propaganda and how we can understand counter-propaganda, is that it does target marginalized groups. So it provides, it serves as a form of authority for those who feel misrepresented, underrepresented by the established media discourse. So they feel that RT provides that and accepts them in a way. So in that, and of course, the Americanized format of reporting helps here, because it relativizes. So it shows, yeah, we can do the same. We can be like Americans do it, like Hollywood does it. But we help those who are not represented. So this is kind of a selling point that works both for the viewers and for journalists, in my opinion.
Heidi?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Igor, thank you very much for your question about the monument and why this is such a key playing point. I would say it's part of Russian public diplomacy, because monuments are something that local Russians can relate to. So a lot of these efforts abroad are targeted, yes, at abroad audiences also, but we have to keep in mind that everything Russia does abroad, it also has to consider its local audience. And I think sometimes as researchers, we get focused on one end and we forget about the other. Like the media initiatives by the Russian Federation, these different foreign policy tools that they're using, they're aimed, yes, at foreign policy tools, but they're also aimed at creating internal cohesion and support. And monuments are something that's very embedded in the Russian discourse, in the local Russian discourse. So if Russians read something abroad about this monument, Russians in Russia can get behind it and really support the initiative. And it works also because monuments are an international symbol. and they represent different things to different people. So this is really a polarization tool that is kind of very easy to use. So, and I think it will be continued to be used. So, because these symbols are constantly changing, which I think was the case in the 2007 example of the bronze soldier also. But the second question that you asked about how the local Russian-speaking minority is treated, I think that many Estonian leaders today would admit that in the 1990s, there were some mistakes made. Because if you're familiar with the passportization policies of Latvia and Estonia, yeah, many like Russian speakers, if they came to Estonia or Latvia after the period of occupation, they were not given citizenship. And they had to go through, actually, like in Estonia, it's very difficult to get citizenship. You have to give up a second citizenship. You have to take a language exam, pass a B2 language exam. There weren't institutions for Russian speakers to learn the local languages. So it wasn't made very easy. It's slowly starting to change. But about the media, in the 1990s also, Estonia had its local Russian station, like the Estonian Russian station by the Estonian Soviet Republic. It was all local, and they closed it. They did not ban, in Estonia, they did not ban any Russian media, as they have done in Latvia. In 2014, 2015, in the Latgale region of Latvia, they actually banned some stations. And the reaction, yeah, exactly as you said, is not very positive. But in the Estonian case, and in the Latvian case, they've been working on making local Russian media since 2014. So they realized that they really missed like 25 years of their audience, and they're slowly trying to bring it back. And recently, actually, with the coronavirus, my colleagues are working actually with other portions of the Russian-speaking population, and they're finding that actually, when it comes to local crises, where you can only get the best information locally, Russian speakers are turning more to Estonian sources of media. They realize that this is the type of media that you can't get from like Russian sources. You won't get the accurate local information. So the information is becoming more and more localized, at least in the Estonian case we've seen.
Yes, you're right, Heidi. The Russian-speaking minority or Russian minority was in a particularly difficult position in Latvia in 90s, even today. When comparing to Estonia, I would say that Lithuania had a relatively, comparing to other two countries, a better policy towards the Russian-speaking minority. Who would like to? Yes, Daniela?
I have questions for Elizaveta that have to do with her paper, and I can postpone them to offline. But I have one online question for Heidi at this point, which is the monument, going back to the monument issue. May 9th seems to be an important day for Estonia and for Russia for different reasons. But one reason that really didn't surface in your speech is that May 9th is supposed to be Europe's Day. And Europe has tried very, very hard to make it a big day for everybody. I remember in the 70s, I was in elementary school, and we had to make drawings about Europe. There was on May 9th an hour devoted to basically European propaganda. We had no idea what to draw, but I mean, I remember that exercise, and I remember that attempt by the European Union to make May 9th Europe's Day visible to everybody. Anything like that in Estonia? I mean, clearly, it's not even remotely in the back of their minds when May 9th arrives that it might be about something other than their monuments. Am I correct?
Yeah, Daniela, thank you very much for the question. Actually, it's a really interesting question because I noticed, especially this year in Estonia, it was everywhere about Europe Day, everything about Europe Day. And I can't really say whether this goes noticed or unnoticed by my respondents because I was asking them questions before and this didn't come up. But this would be a really interesting question to investigate in the future, because the Estonian media really promoted this Europe Day and really referenced how there was some kind of two events happening at the same time, this Europe Day and this 9th of May. So this was really present in the Estonian discourse. And I can't right now, I can't agree that the Russian speakers in Estonia don't recognize that it's Europe Day at all. I can't say that it doesn't have any effect. I can say actually that the 9th of May, when they had like this year, they have, for example, these, I don't know the exact term, but where you carry like different faces of people who served in the war. Like they had some small marches, but these marches in Estonia are very small compared to the marches that happen in Russia, for example. So and they're organized, many of them are organized by kind of very passionate people who are very involved in politics in a certain way. So I wouldn't say that the general population is really all dedicated to this. As I tried to explain from the map, there are different groups and they're involved to like a different extent. But it's a really interesting question to go forward, because actually, like, when you ask Estonians, like Russian-speaking Estonians, about who they are, where they come from, Europe is one thing that's always present. So we're like very happy to live in Estonia, even if you look at the border city of Narva, which is like you walk across the border, like you can cross the bridge and you're in Russia. But people there say that they see the difference, but they want their city to be like a place where Europe and Russia meet to have like a handshake. So they see themselves as very European, but they kind of want to be the ones that represent this partnership between Europe and Russia. So they see their city in this way. So I wouldn't say that this Europe Day is something that they don't even notice or they haven't noticed. But this is something that I'm going to keep in mind for my next project next year.
Thank you, Heidi. I think that this discussion now drives us to a discussion about collective memories and history, which is a very actual and never everlasting issue, not only in Europe. As Pierre Nora says, monuments, all so-called memory sites, including monuments and archives and so on, are there to support, or memory drivers are to support a certain type of collective memory. But the problem is when you have societies divided like Estonia, when the same monument can support a different type of collective memories, and then the two different collective memories see the same site. Do you want to make a comment, Vitaly? We are waiting for your comment.
Sure. So first of all, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to join you guys, and I'm really, really excited about your reports and researches. Quick to myself, I am currently a visiting scholar at Harvard University, but I do a lot for years professional work in the field of elections, in the field of oppositional elections in Russia, in Ukraine, in Belarus. That's my main topic of research, but also my main job, where I help oppositional campaigns, oppositional activists, or Navalny's of this world to run against authoritarian regimes and authoritarian regimes. This is my specialty. And I just want to comment quickly on Elizaveta's presentation. I may a little bit disagree with her statement. I agree that propaganda has a sort of like systematic way of work, but where I have a little bit doubts, I disagree with the statement that it's not well developed concept as such. I believe it's quite developed and defined strategy what they do. Igor took away a little bit of my argument already. He said it already, mentioned, and I agree with Igor. I believe the strategy is quite defined, and Putin himself. And I believe Elizaveta quoted it, said that the main reason of RT, main idea, is to give a stage for Russian views of news. And I believe they are quite successful in it, because partly they are really creative, slick. They are not having any limits, like let's say different news station. In comparison, I work a lot with Voice of America, and it was quite and it still is quite a big news agency worldwide, and they have relatively same annual budget like Russia Today. So as much as I recall, I believe they have $220 million annual budget, and Russia Today has around 300, which is quite comparable. But if you compare programming of Russia Today worldwide and Voice of America, you will notice that they have quite fresh and modern and creative way of like spreading the news and dealing with news. And of course, talking about propaganda and the limits of propaganda, of course, I agree. They have the limits. Let's say the Voice of America news channel has, because they are paid from taxpayer money from State Department, and they have to report to the like American institution of check and balances for their work yearly, and produce reports about what they do. And they have, of course, in terms of check and balances, quite a complicated system of control. Versus RT just gets the money to spend. They, in this sense, look like, or they appear like little startup. They don't have any limits in terms of salaries or the way what they do. They are really can they really can try new things, and it's probably it's like compare a startup and a huge international multinational company with a stock exchange trade. So they operate differently because of this public trade, unlike small startup from Silicon Valley. So in this sense, I believe the RT has a really defined and developed concept, even though, of course, the systematic approach is quite clear. And Heidi, just quick note, I really loved your research. I really personally find it, because it finds intersection with my research, quite interesting, and looking forward, I believe it would be interesting to see and to research the same phenomena in a different cultural regions like Ukraine that battles the same problem with Russian-speaking minorities, and then taking it further to Germany, quite interesting place to research, because AfD's successes last years, and then take it further to Russian-speaking minorities in United States, which has also quite local, but still influence on the media around New York, LA, and let's say California. So all in one, great to meet you guys, and love to be invited again.
Before turning the floor to somebody who would like to comment, and finally Igor to make his contribution to today's discussion, I would like to say that I agree very much with what Vitaly mentioned. In the case of Balkans, for example, I can recognize, as to Russian media, definitely value-based propaganda, which can be associated to what a local population can describe as Orthodox Christian values. And then this propaganda promoted by Russian media serves as a counter-narrative to the official narratives of pro-Western political elites. And it's very popular among ordinary population, particularly among Serbs. And then Sputnik, not RT, is there the leading actor. And what makes difference between the Baltics or Ukraine or other places with Russian-speaking minority, Balkans people, Balkan Slavs, Orthodox Slavs, they don't speak Russian. They don't have history or culture watching. They don't watch Russian media. But what Russian media did, and that speaks about state action behind the strategy, is that they, in the last several years, opened up hundreds of outlets of Russian media, particularly in Serbia. One of Serbian NGOs, think tank, mapped more than 109 either Russian associated or Russian media in Serbia. And from there, they disseminate information in Serbian language. And their information is then amplified by Serbian local media. And when end user read media, end users don't recognize anymore whether piece of info comes from Russia media or local media, which then this is what makes really propaganda successful and impactful in terms of shaping minds and attitudes of people living there. So any comment from two presenters before I turn to Igor?
Just one very quick comment to Vitaly. I think that the case of Ukraine is very different. I don't think you can, there's no such thing really. It's not very clearly identified groups, the Russian-speaking Ukrainians, because I'm from Ukraine. My primary language is Russian. And so is majority of people that grew up or lived in the city that I grew up in the East. And a lot of them have a very different identity now that they had before 2014. that didn't change the language they speak. A lot of Ukrainians understand both languages anyways, even though they may speak one. So in Ukraine, the issue of language and identity are not as neatly kind of counterimposed as it would be in Estonia, for example. That's just one quick comment.
But as we talk not about identity in terms of a language, but the perception of media, and through the media perception, the way you consume media, in which language you consume, first of all, and secondly, how it influences you as a let's say Ukrainian person with particular view towards Russia and Ukraine. I believe there could be slight differences if you research and poll or do the interviews with people. I agree with you, Ala, on the statement about this verge of 2014 that didn't change much or change significantly the way Ukraine is Russian speaking and Ukrainian speaking. Ukraine is divided now. But what I believe, and I know a lot because I'm quite often in Ukraine and work there a lot too. And by the way, I speak Ukrainian as well. I know a lot of people who consume primarily news through Russian-speaking and let's say biased or not biased, but through language alone biased perception of news. And I believe this is really interesting to see how this correlates, let's say, to results from Baltics or let's say Germany.
I have to give floor to presenters and Igor, otherwise we can continue like this. We can organize, because what Vitaly just mentioned and you mentioned resembles the ongoing debate between Montenegro and Serbia about languages, identities, church, and orientation. But we can organize another workshop to discuss that issue. And I personally researched that, particularly the role of Orthodox churches and how Russia uses Orthodox Church to reach out at local population and advance its policy. But this is for another workshop. I would like Elizaveta and Heidi, please.
I can finish up this topic quickly. That Vitaly, actually my colleagues in the university, one of them is researching this very topic about Ukraine and media usage in Ukraine. So if we can connect later, I can very happily share this. And another colleague in my faculty has actually compared Russian speakers in Germany with Russian speakers in Estonia. So these Russian speakers in the US would be very interesting. But if Elizaveta can maybe share contacts and information, I would be very happy to share some of the work that's already been done. So thank you for the suggestion.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we can just share all the information and presentations afterwards. And my next research project is actually also on RT social media campaigns in the US and Germany. So yeah, that's also something sort of to look forward to. But just to comment on Vitaly's comments about the lack, or rather that, as you commented, there is a well-developed concept, and that concept is to give a stage to Russian views. I mean, these may be just semantics, but I just don't think that this promoting a Russian view is a well-defined concept, because Russian views change all the times, and there is not such a clear analysis of what's going on, and that's why I call this a primarily tactical effort, because depending on the political situation, these views change, and sometimes even quite drastically. I show that in my paper that one day RT promotes conspiracy theories, the other day, like now with coronavirus, they actually debunk conspiracy theories. So this is something that it just constantly changes, and it's a very adaptive attitude. Of course, I do not deny that there are some views, and I think that it is quite different what RT promotes in English and what RT promotes in local languages. And for that, I mean, Sputnik and RT are two different beasts, because Sputnik is actually Innoveshania. It comes from Innoveshania, and in the Soviet Union, they had, I don't know how many languages they broadcasted in. It's countless languages, and now they've been trying to revive it with Sputnik news concept. Also, actually, quite there. Even in the name, you can see quite a bit of Soviet references. And about the Orthodox conservative values, I agree totally that these values are there and that they are promoted in some areas, in particular in the post-Soviet space. But these are the values that are not very much promoted on RT English, because they realize that there will not be that many respondents to that. So they have to adapt to the target audience of the area where they broadcast. So I just don't think that there is much disagreement there. It's probably just how you frame it, what you mean by a well-defined concept. And if you compare it to what was defined and what I've seen in the archives of the Soviet Union, this was super detailed, codified information of how to do this, of how to do that, of what kind of narratives are allowed to be said, what narratives are not allowed to be said. So it was very, very detailed in terms of what journalists are allowed to do, which just simply does not exist on RT. So RT is primarily about self-censorship. That is why I feel that there is quite a big difference on that front. Yeah.
Heidi?
I think I'll leave my main comments with just that actually my research is just one case study, but it's part of a bigger project that is comparing Russian-speaking minority in other regions also. So I would be very happy just to share some more information. So if anybody has specific questions, particularly about Ukraine, Estonia, or Latvia, and Germany, I can recommend some articles also that you can feel free to contact me if Elizaveta will share my email with you.
I would like to thank presenters for their presentations and to encourage them to continue research. And I would like to thank to everybody who have been with us during this workshop. Maybe it's now time, Elizabeth warned me at the beginning, but I missed saying so, to introduce myself. It's high time to do so. I'm Vesko Gačević. I'm professor of the practice of international relations, former ambassador who served in NATO. And what actually made me relatively a good fit to this discussion is the fact that I was a national coordinator for NATO in my country and in charge of a campaign, public campaign in Montenegro, when I had to deal with Russian counter campaign all the time. To save time, I dropped the idea to present what Russia has been doing in the Western Balkans. But I'm at your disposal if you have interest in learning more about it. And then since we are all part of the same family, so feel free to reach out to me and to continue today's discussion. Thank you once again. Thank you for hosting this event center. Thank you, Daniela, too. See you soon, guys.